So, Pathfinders, if you're just soaring the galaxy in hopes to discover a new verdant planet that's underpopulated, filled with embarrassment, botched timelines, messy lip sync, wonky animation, and faces that look like this, well, you found it, because this is Planet What Happened, and we're talking about the game that basically killed a franchise, and not just any old franchise like your Fears, your Golden Axes, or your Mirror's Edges. I'm talking about friggin' Mass Effect, which is currently on hold according to EA, and it was all due to the lofty ambitions and technical shortcomings of the fourth game in the series, Andromeda. Mass Effect, the trilogy that was perfectly executed, promised everything and delivered even more, and had one of the most satisfying conclusions loved by fans the world over.
Kinda just want to take it and just...
Yeah, while Andromeda had a whole host of problems all its own that we're going to certainly dive into, BioWare Edmonton's flagship IP wasn't exactly at an all-time high when they handed the space reins of the franchise to their sister studio in Montreal. You might even say that BioWare dinged the side of their ship into an asteroid and then just gave said ship to their younger sibling as a hand-me-down. The Edmonton studio didn't mind because they had their sights set onto bigger and better things. While there's been lots of tales told in the stars about Andromeda already, the most accurate insight into its troubled development cycle comes from Jason Schreier's article on the same subject, which you can find in the description below if you'd like some additional details. However, this is Planet What Happened you're now standing on, so if you want a more visual tour of how a writer and their crew of idiots destroyed one of the 7th generation's biggest franchises in one fell swoop, well, strap in, cause there's gonna be some turbulence. To start, let's hop into a wormhole real quick to about 2008. BioWare were quick to make changes to the journey of Commander Shepard whenever people complained loudly enough. If the Mako wasn't fun to drive, they'd cut it in the next game. If the people complained about the combat in Mass Effect 2, then BioWare would just make it into a shooter. One of those earlier concepts that was attempted but not really fleshed out all that well was exploring the surface of alien worlds, which was present in the first game but scaled back dramatically, i.e. cut completely in the sequels that followed. Therefore, the entire genesis of Andromeda was to revisit that concept with the new technology and tools afforded to developers. Now, to be fair, this is a pretty damn good angle to take to help justify the existence of this entire project. Andromeda was something outside the gravitational pull of the original trilogy, so no Shepard, no Reapers, no Seth Green, thank God. It would focus, however, on what Mass Effect was all about, having snooze new with weird aliens. So this isn't a terrible start so far. What was terrible though was the very next idea they had immediately after. To properly convey the concept of exploration, they wanted players to be able to explore dozens of worlds, nay hundreds, and that's when the dreaded words, procedural generation, were uttered. Now, in 2013, when Andromeda was in the concepting phase, it was a pretty wild idea to start thinking of procedural generation at that scale. I mean, Hello Games were still making cute little Joe Dangers at this point, so for BioWare Montreal, who had only cut their teeth on Mass Effect 3 DLC, to attempt such a thing is rather commendable. Or maybe not. During this time, they would be led by one Gerard Léonie, a fresh hire from Quebec City where he worked at Activision-owned Beanox. His qualifications? Well, he directed their worst Spider-Man titles, so there's that. Now though, with a massive world to play around in and equally massive budget, he embraced the idea of freedom the player would enjoy, exploring an entire solar system. In Andromeda, you'd be able to travel to any planet in real time via your ship, touch down and start poking and prodding and having sex with whatever. An anonymous developer who worked at BioWare Montreal said everyone was excited by the idea. Imagine No Man's Sky with BioWare graphics and story. It sounded amazing. This idea, however, is what caused the main crack in the hull of the Andromeda ship, which unfortunately then splintered off into dozens of smaller issues. Letting the player discover so many planets was that enticing of a feature that would eat up the majority of the project's 5-year dev cycle, as various technical leads would soon realize the realities of making it work across the scope of a Mass Effect game. There was no way all those environments could have that handcrafted feel that ME fans had become accustomed to, so the studio opted for a bit of software called World Machine, which would build the bulk of the topography. Now, typically, whenever an inexperienced developer starts using new, ambitious technology, that's enough for a What Happened episode right there. But, like the galaxy itself, the potential for even more things to go wrong are simply limitless. While the idea of so much explorable real estate was BioWare's faux pas, the next one was 100% Electronic Arts' doing. You know they were coming eventually. Around this time, EA would start mandating that all their studios needed to switch to DICE's Frostbite engine, as it is immensely powerful in doing the things it was designed to do, which was to run first-person shooters and not really much else. There were no solutions for things like inventories, party management, and just about everything you'd expect in an action RPG. Why EA thought this was a good idea is, I honestly don't have an answer. When everything is done in first person, or if you're playing a multiplayer match, you don't really need expressive animations for your main character because you tend to not see them. BioWare Edmonton, however, also had to use Frostbite for Dragon Age Inquisition. While they fortunately did create a lot of the systems they needed for that game, which did help out the Montreal team, there was still even more basic features and functions they had to make from scratch for themselves. This in turn lost them a lot of time in the process, which, in case you guessed it, will be a running theme. This collaborative process between studios was something that BioWare was pushing at the time, as they had their main Edmonton office, Montreal, and then the one in Austin, Texas, with the idea being that all three studios would be able to conference to design and problem solve together. It was called One BioWare, which didn't go smoothly. A level of competitiveness grew between the studios, and even paranoia and distrust would eventually settle in, as Montreal felt Edmonton was trying to take over and even poach some of their talent for their projects, whilst Edmonton felt Montreal was drowning in the design phase, which was something only they could fix. All of this was compounded by the fact that both studios were on opposite ends of Canada, while there were other smaller offices in Russia, China, and India who were all given outsourced work, leading to a logistical nightmare to coordinate all the studios with not enough producers to handle the workload.
Well, shit.
Spoilers, BioWare stopped doing this after Andromeda shipped. We are now in 2014 and Montreal was still struggling to design around all that procedural generation, just trying to suss out how quests and NPCs would work. This then, of course, had a ripple effect across all the other aspects of the design. The overarching story, the dialogue, and the animation all took a back seat. The combat and vehicular components of the game, something Frostbite excelled at, were however going smoothly. This was also the year where a lot of people just started to leave BioWare. Casey Hudson, who was shepherding the project from Edmonton, left due to issues with good old Bob Dylan.
Yeah, so we started Anthem, which was Project Dylan back then, and
Gerard Leone also got the fuck out of the Andromeda galaxy with no clear reason as to why, but I assume it's because he saw the writing on the wall.
Good luck with that.
He was leading the story team and was considered the creative head of the project, thus leaving it rudderless until Mac Walters, a writer on the original Mass Effect trilogy, was brought in to steer the ship. This would mark the space where Montreal would really need to start narrowing their focus, because even though the procedural generation and exploration on the planet's surfaces was taking shape, it wasn't very fun.
If it's not fun, why bother?
A former Anani who worked on Andromeda explains, they were creating planets and you could drive around on them and the mechanics of it were there. However, they were never able to do it in a way that felt compelling, where you could imagine doing it 100 or 1,000 more times. Now, how could you possibly get to that level of production, building vehicles and planets and aliens that are always moaning for the boning, and not realize that it wasn't even fun or interesting? A lot of games in and around that time, and even before that, lived and died by their vertical slice, a small sliver of the game that acted as a proof of concept. Andromeda never got that, as everyone was so taken by the possibilities of an explorable solar system that they just pushed ahead with the design for almost 3 years before they, stopped. By the end of 2015, the heads of the project started to realize that trying to brute force the procedural generation as the backbone of the gameplay simply wasn't going to work out. Thus, they thought it best to default to a map-based system similar to past Mass Effects, which should have been decided much earlier on.
We have a plan. Kind of. Pretty solid. Jal?
The team, however, at least wanted to offer more planets than any other game before it, so they planned for 30 different environments that would be made with a combination of procedural generation and handcrafted elements. This was, of course, the initial plan, because as anyone who played the final game knows, that was quickly reduced to 7, which is actually being really generous, as that's counting the tutorial world that you can't even really revisit, and some of those you can't even explore by foot, Jesus Christ. These huge decisions and cuts only really started to happen a year and a half before Andromeda's early 2018 release date, with people familiar with the development admitting that the game finally started to be a game around this time. It really wasn't until Mac Walters came on board, and that was very much a reaction to the state of the game's critical path, where he finally gave it direction and got it into shape. No, wait a minute. Well, okay, you have a game that was running massively behind schedule, was far too ambitious in its features, and was being published by a huge company that values money and fiscal quarters over everything else. What could possibly save the day, or what tried and true solution can get Andromeda out on time? Does anyone know of any way they could...
Hello there, and welcome to Cap'n Crunch's Crunchling Adventure.
One developer stated that this last year and a half crunching on Andromeda was the worst they'd ever experienced in their career. Working on that game so late was very difficult and harder than it should have been. This crunch was mostly driven due to the fact that when all the game systems finally got implemented, now that they had a cohesive vision, it was much later in the development cycle than normal, so bugs started to crop up at an alarming rate, faster than BioWare Montreal could fix them. What's more is that due to the very jigsaw-like nature of the game, running on a modified Frostbite engine, some features coded by BioWare Edmonton, some made by Scratch from Montreal, procedural generation, a character creator, if something broke in the game, it inevitably broke some other unrelated areas, which would lead to a loss of forward momentum. Programmers had to go back multiple times to fix things they thought had been fixed. Having spent 7 years as a bug tester myself, I'll explain this in slightly more detail. If you are assigned to regressing bugs, you comb through a database of issues that programmers claim are fixed, and you attempt to replicate the problem to make sure. If you can't, well then good, case closed. But if you can, then the programmer has to go back and fix it again. This is literally losing any ground you had previously made, and is a reason why Andromeda was so unpolished on the day of release. 1 step forward, 3 or 4, 5 steps back. We'll put something together, and it's been bug tested and signed off and approved. We then say, okay, we can now move on from that to the next thing, and while our backs are turned, what we just put together would be falling apart. Previously fixed issues breaking again could be caused by almost anything. Changes to the lighting engine, a core system, anything breaking in a major pipeline would cause issues downstream, and downstream usually meant more supplementary things like graphics, audio, animation, you know, the things that you could easily turn into memes. This then leads us into the animation itself, because it's an especially egregious blemish on the path of the Pathfinder. The animation team within BioWare Montreal were always understaffed, coupled with the fact that Frostbite didn't have its own custom solution for elaborate animations you need for cutscenes, dialogue trees, and the like. While there are lots of wonderful programs specifically designed for facial animation, none of them played especially well with Frostbite. Another big factor is that Autodesk, makers of both 3D Studio Max and Maya, suggested that the studio switch to Maya, despite all their animation work having been done on 3D Studio Max at that point, which both BioWare and EA higher-ups agreed to, resulting in the loss of hundreds of hours of work. The animation team wasn't happy, as such a decision should have been made earlier on in pre-production. Also, due to the numerous delays in realizing the scope, story, and sequences of the game, this cut into the overall time the animation team had to just put everything together. It's sad, because animation is one of the things Andromeda got lambasted for the most, especially online by fans, but the team were dealt a bad hand here, and for whatever reason, BioWare Montreal would not hire more people to bolster their ranks, even if one of them decided to resign. Things started to look really shaky in the last few months leading to launch, as the game really didn't seem to be doing anything different than the original trilogy, despite it having an all-new story. BioWare Montreal knew the game was going to be less than warmly received than the previous entries, but were hopeful they could build off what they had learned to craft a massively improved sequel. However, the critical reception and the 5 days of early access players got on Origin sealed the team's hopes. This resulted in forums and social media being flooded with things like this, that, and oh, can't forget that. What's more is that 2017 was a kind of a good year for video games. Horizon Zero Dawn, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and Nier Automata, all well-loved future classics, all released within 3 weeks of Andromeda, which made the first full game by BioWare Montreal look like a joke in comparison. Undaunted, the team were doing their best, trying to put out patches to fix all these issues, but when you're the worst selling game in franchise history, you could feel EA's axe hovering above your head.
It's in the game.
If the game had any DLC content planned for the single-player story, it was cancelled. Many employees at BioWare Montreal were relocated to EA Motive before then just merging with the company in August of that same year, effectively shutting down the studio. And EA themselves announced that Mass Effect would be going on hiatus.
All that effort and no credits to show for it. Story of my life.
It's now 2019 and there's still no indication if it will ever return. It's all pretty sad because the core of Andromeda, letting the players spearhead an adventure into an uncharted section of space with hundreds of worlds to visit, has an appeal. The technology, however, just wasn't there. When you further hamper that with an uncooperative engine and the like, it's a pipe dream that just won't ever work out. And while some feel that No Man's Sky has improved enough to make such an adventure palatable, that's not something EA is willing to invest in the long term. If a project doesn't go exactly as they planned, pretty much immediately, they're fairly quick to stomp out all signs of that failure. The list of their studios is long, but their list of casualties is even longer. Whoa, so if you know of any other galaxy-sized gutters filled with glitchy garbage, let me know in the comments below or fly your nomad over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon to officially vote on our next subject. See you next time, weird space aliens, and thanks for watching.